Good. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. George's Talks. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen in St. Georg's Gespräche. This is a monthly series of talks, but from a former German Lutheran church in Whitechapel in the city, just outside the city of London. I won't do any more German apart from that initial introduction, because most of us here are English speakers, and most of you who are attending online also English speakers. But just to make that connection with the past, a German congregation that once worshipped here. The building is full of German memorials. It's a wonderful place to come and sit in for an evening, very atmospheric. 260 years old now and hardly changed in that time. Built in 1762 by a community of German sugar bakers, sugar refiners, who had the skills that were lacking in this country when at that time. So they made use of themselves by coming here and remained here, grew up, brought up families here through the 18th century into the 19th century, and remained the congregation of this church right up until about 2000, when they migrated to a more modern church in London as a congregation, but still retained links here with St. George's as committee members, and I'm one of those. I'm proud to be serve on this committee to keep this church going, and the talks that we have an audience in front of me now present at monthly contribute to the upkeep of this wonderful old building. It's been conserved, and our speaker this evening has had a career in conservation of historic buildings. For many years, he was the conservation officer for Islington Council. He doubled his working life there with writing books, which he has been doing since the 1980s, the early 1980s. He grew up in Cambridge. That was the title of his first book, Growing Up in Cambridge. He was a student at Cambridge and his working life here in London. So we couldn't have a more appropriate guest this evening to talk from this building. Would you welcome now, please, Mr. Alec Forshaw.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to share the screen. That's it, I think. Is that working? No, not yet. It says screen one, is it? Screen one. That's what I've clicked on. Oh, you want to share screen two, actually? Screen two. Okay, let's try that. Is that up? Okay, so I can get out of that now. Right, okay, I think we're there, aren't we?
Sorry, not yet.
Are we not? Well, that's the first slide. Is that right?
I don't think we're sharing it.
Okay. Technology.
Isn't it wonderful? So I want to share that screen. Your screen share is loading. There we go.
Okay, very good. Well, very good evening, and it's wonderful to be in this fabulous building. We're going to talk about, well, I'm going to talk about the 1980s. Seems a long time ago, now in the 2020s, four decades ago.
I really do apologise. We're sharing that screen on the other one. So
sorry,
yeah, my fault.
Okay.
So let's try that again. Share screen. This one.
That's the one I did click on before.
Alison, can you see whether that's sharing the right thing? Is it? Can you see two postage stamps or one? Can you see two postage stamps?
Postage stamps.
No, that's correct.
It's correct. Okay. Right. Let's go. Let's try the next slide. Well, there's nothing working here. Dear. Why isn't it moving on? Can you come? Should be moving, shouldn't it?
I'm trying doing that.
Can do. Can you not use this one?
You can now because.
Okay, all right. So, London was a very different place 40 years ago. And quite a lot of this is going to be a bit of a nostalgia trip. But also, what I'm going to try and show is that a lot of today is very much based on what happened in the 1970s. We're still living with the consequences of the 1920s. And indeed, many of the issues which were faced by London's people in the 1980s are being revisited again sort of today. So yeah, London was full of traffic. That's Piccadilly Circus, just clogged up with vehicles. There were car parks everywhere. A lot of bomb sites still in London that hadn't been built on, and they were mainly used for car parking. There were derelict industrial sites. I mean, London had been one of the great industrial cities in the 20th century. But a lot of those industries declined, moved out of London, or simply folded up in the 1980s. And there was a huge amount of derelict land around. Now, the dominant figure, of course, throughout the 1980s politically was Thatcher. Elected in 1979, and she went right through the whole decade. So there's just one prime minister the whole decade. It's quite unusual. But there were sort of ructions going on politically as well. The Labour Party was sort of fragmenting in a way, and the Social Democratic Party was formed out of these four, the Gang of Four: Roy Jenkins, David Owen, William Rogers, and Shirley Williams. So there they are, forming their breakaway party, which was going to change the world. But then you had, at a more local level, the Greater London Council was dominated by Ken Livingstone, and there you see him on the left. And the gentleman on the right-hand side is John McDonnell, very young looking, who obviously became the shadow chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn's sort of regime. I was working in Islington, as Rick has said, for that whole decade, and there was another woman who dominated Islington, very politically different to Margaret Thatcher, but another Margaret. This is Margaret Hodge, now a very sort of senior member of the Labour Party. She was MP for Newham. She's been on all sorts of select committees. She's one of the sort of great and good now. She certainly wasn't great and good in the 1980s in the eyes of the government anyway. Islington was known as the Socialist Republic. It flew the red flag over the town hall very proudly. And it was a very interesting place to work, I can tell you. The huge housing program that they had developed in the social housing in the 1970s, Margaret Hodge was determined to carry on with, even though the government cut all the money. So Islington almost went bankrupt. Unemployment was a massive issue in the 1980s because a lot of these industries were folding up. And employment figures, you saw those in the background from the Ken Livingstone shot. The unemployment figures were blazoned up on County Hall. This is the employment office in Islington. The photographer must have got a very good way of making people smile. You think they'd be miserable, but there they're all beaming away. But there were empty industries everywhere. This is very close to here. This is the Shoreditch furniture making district. And it was on its knees. It's all empty buildings. And just one wondered what on earth was going to happen This is Hoxton Square, just nobody about really. Smithfield, on the north side of the city, the great meat market, that area had been dominated by a lot of food and drink manufacture, sausage makers, bacon curers, all sorts of, and they were all folding up, either closing up altogether or moving out of London. This is some of the old smokeries just off Cow Street where bacon was smoked, being demolished. It's Farringdon Road, huge warehouse building on Farringdon Road, partially demolished here and cleared away actually in the 1990s. In Clerkenwell, there'd been all these specialist metallurgy firms, engravers, platers, non-ferrous metals, clockmakers, highly skilled jobs, but they was really struggling in the 1980s. And Clerkenwell, I mean, it looked as though there'd just been an air raid, really. And this is 1981. Absolutely amazing. Derelict sites. Yeah, London was certainly at a crossroads. Battersea Power Station was still working. It finally stopped in 1983, running, of course, on coal, which came by train or by barge on the river, which is why it's on the river for that and the water supply. There it is. It was a very large site, lots of big sheds and things. And then there was another power station still functioning on the river, Bankside, now of course Tate Modern. And there it is. That finally stopped operating in 1986. Extraordinary. Again, running on coal. One of the industries that attracted everybody's attention in terms of the change was Fleet Street. And this sort of exemplified what was going on, really. Now, Fleet Street, not only did it have the big offices of the newspapers, but it was also the factories. It's where the paper came in, where it was printed. People were working through the night with hot metal to print all set out all the blocks, run everything off. It was a very, very industrial area. And it had its institutions here, the journalists. It was very much a nighttime place. And of course, there was a new technical innovation. And one man in particular, this is Rupert Murdoch, doesn't look like that now particularly, but he's still around. He decided that he was going to embrace the new technology and have a confrontation with the unions. And he did, not by half. He built, sort of secretly in Wapping, a new printing establishment, Fortress Wapping it was known as, which was entirely computer run. So it didn't use any of the traditional methods at all. And he came up right, here it is, Fortress Wapping behind sort of brick walls, very high security. And the traditional print workers were sacked. So there was a huge, this was really London's equivalent of the miners' strike. There was quite a lot of violence, demonstrations and police and all sorts. And again, I mean, as with the miners, it was a victory for the proprietors, and the Fleet Street was changed. Fleet Street essentially closed down. All the printing moved out of Fleet Street and Bouverie Street and Tudor Street, and the bars, which there used to be lots of bars for all the journalists and places that would stay open all night. they all closed, and it became a desert. And that coincided with massive reforms brought in by the government to deregulate the financial markets, known as the Big Bang. There's very much something that Margaret Thatcher wanted to do. She felt that the city of London was a sort of closed shop, that it was cliquey, it was like a club, a gentleman's club. She was very against that. She wanted it to be sort of open for anybody to go and work there. And so the stock exchange was deregulated, and the sort of traditional, this is the sort of thing that Margaret Thatcher hated, I think, this sort of sense of gentlemen had all been to the same school, to the same university, or whatever. She wanted to break that. This is something that sprang up in the early 1980s. LIFI, it was called, the London International Financial Futures Exchange. And this was sort of open market where people were essentially gambling on the future value of things. Absolutely extraordinary, and a completely different sort of people working here. These were young people, often from not from university backgrounds at all, completely different. It was jazzy, it was loud, boisterous. People made huge amounts of money in a morning, and lose huge amounts of money as well. A lot of the brains behind all this was Nigel Lawson, who's the Chancellor Exchequer. He's just died, hasn't he, a few days ago. And then here he is, very, very powerful figure. He was really it was really his ideas that convinced Thatcher to do all this. His other big idea was privatization of the public utilities, particularly, I mean, most famous was gas board and all these adverts that they had about Sid and whatever. It was very successful. These people bought these shares, and the shares went up in value. And people like Harry Enfield, there he is, loads of money. That was the sort of spirit of the age, that you could make a lot of money from not really doing much, just have a bit of luck. So it was a very sort of new ethos, really, I think. And of course, I think we're still sort of living with that today, very much so. Other bits of technology were coming in. The mobile phone, quite a clunky, it was known as the brick, I think, to begin with. Yeah, quite a cumbersome thing compared to what we have today. But this was the beginning of what we now all live with. I mean, we're sort of, most people seem to be dominated by their mobile phones. Look at very little else. There were other gadgets like answer phones, jolly expensive actually when they came in, £130 for much, which is a lot of money in those days. But it was really the computer on the desk, quite a clunky big bit of plastic, but this began to take over the workplace, the office workplace. And here we have it, serried ranks, battery chickens almost. I mean, this is what was now the new way forward. This is the new way of working. And it particularly affected the City of London. Now, before the 1980s, this is a sort of aerial view of the city taken in the very late 1970s. And it shows a city that had been sort of rebuilt after all the bomb damage. So the 1950s buildings were, they were very sort of low tech, low floor to ceiling heights, compartmentalized offices, not what the new trading floors wanted, with their huge areas for computer screens. And so a lot of these buildings began to be cleared away. And here is the the sort of building that went up in the 1980s. Now, these were, well, in the trade, they were known as ground scrapers. They weren't tall buildings. There was no demand for tall buildings in the 1980s. It was big, huge floor plates that were needed, maybe only 5, 6, 7 stories high. One of the opportunity areas, as well as Fleet Street, was the area around Liverpool Street Station, and not very far from here. The station next to Liverpool Street, Broad Street Station, was closed. This had been the terminus for the North London line, and they're the rather sad platforms that were there. It was demolished in the 1980s, and just going back, here you can see, it's a car park, of course, to produce, but this was a site for development, and it was indeed developed for a huge new scheme, which became known as Broadgate. And here are some of the buildings. One of the attractions of it was this ice rink, rather an American idea, although we didn't really have the climate to support an ice rink in the winter that needed freezing all the time. But this was the phase. Now, a lot of this stuff has been pulled down now and rebuilt in the last 10 years. But this was a very American sort of concept, new methods of building buildings, which came from Chicago, American architects, American construction techniques, everything in steel and glass, getting away from sort of bricks and mortar. And this stuff was thrown up incredibly quickly. I mean, buildings were built within 6 months, sort of kit of parts and assembled on site. Quite remarkable. Millions of square feet of offices were built in a few years. And it extended north up towards Shoreditch. This is looking back at the city at the north end of Liverpool Street Station, which was extended. And this was all built on for Broadgate. And elsewhere, these sort of huge, rather lumpy buildings were going up. This is in London Wall, a great big hulk of an office building built by Terry Farrell. Well, conservationists were in a minority, which I'd say, in the city at that time. It was basically laissez-faire, build what you want. But there was worry, or there had been worry about tall buildings. Now, this is a sketch that was done by Save Britain's Heritage. And the upper image shows the London skyline, the cities. This is from Waterloo Bridge, looking to the city. And you can see St. Paul's is dominant there, isn't it? And in the lower image, we have the NatWest Tower. Now, the NatWest Tower had been started in the late 70s, and it was completed in about 1983. And there was huge amount of concern that the dominance of St. Paul's was broken here by this taller building, the NatWest Tower. That's what you see today. The NatWest Tower has almost disappeared. It's tiny compared to the huge buildings that are still being erected. So the NatWest Tower is interesting, and it was the first building to really break the spell, if you like, of the dominance of St. Paul's. But as I say, during the rest of the 1980s, there was no demand for tall buildings. It was just these ground scrapers. The tall buildings came later. Looking eastwards from the monument, beyond, east of Tower Bridge, downstream, an extraordinary area of docklands. Now, London's docklands had closed up. They'd started really with containerization in the late 60s, and then in the 70s, the docks were empty. Thousands of acres of land doing nothing. This is an aerial shot of Wapping, and you could see sort of big areas and some of the docks, just nothing going on at all. Further out, the Royal Docks, just an extraordinary wasteland. Michael Heseltine thought that something should be done about this. And actually he, unlike the rest of the cabinet, I think, at the time, believed in government intervention. And so he got his way here, and the London Docklands Corporation was set up. Sorry, yeah. Yes.
Thames barrier.
Yes, it is. I'm going to come on to that. Yes, yeah. So the London Docklands Corporation was set up, and a huge amount of government money went into this to get it going. At the time, people were very critical, I think, that this was an area of laissez-faire planning, and there were big sort of tax dodges for the developers and whatever. But actually, a lot of government money had to go in to provide infrastructure. Now, the Docklands, if you walked around in the 1980s, it was the most remarkable area. I mean, there were some beautiful buildings just sitting there, gently rotting away. For a photographer, it was an absolute dream. The very evocative scenes of decay. This is Narrow Street. I mean, it's unrecognizable today, but there it is, all sort of shut up. And there were these roads which had big walls along them. And this because quite a lot of the docks had been sort of gated, sort of bonded warehouses, high security. And some of these roads are really rather daunting to go down because there's sort of no escape and nobody about. It's quite a weird landscape. Nature beginning to reclaim itself. And then down on the Isle of Dogs, it's sort of strange landscape with some of the rag and bone men or totters would keep their horses down there. Just an amazing part of the world. Well, things did begin to change in Docklands. New buildings started to spring up. Say these developers didn't have to pay any tax, they didn't need planning permission, they could just build whatever they wanted. But a huge amount of money went into providing this railway, the Docklands Light Railway. Extraordinary bit of kit, really, because it didn't have a driver. This was one of the first, well, certainly the first in this country, train not to have a driver. In fact, instead of the Docklands Light Railway, it was known as the driverless railway, I think, by some. And it's still there, quite clunky and slow, but it was essential because how else was anybody ever to get to work? And the building started to come. Here we got a view of the West India docks and extraordinary building at the bottom on the river. The Cascades, which is a residential building, here it is, with Piers Goff as the architect. Remarkable bit of design, really. It's now a listed building. And then just further around, a pumping station, John Outram, in this amazing sort of neo-Egyptian style. But what was really sort of dominating the news, what was coming out of the ground, is Canary Wharf. Olympia and York, American developers, and building something that was going to far exceed the height of the NatWest Tower. It was going to be the tallest building in Europe. This is looking across at Docklands in the early 1980s. This is Greenwich. So we're looking over the Queen's House, across the river, and there are the cranes of Docklands. And the few tallish buildings are 1960s blocks of flats. Well, there it is today, same view. And it all started really with Canary Wharf. Now, one gentleman who got very involved with the architectural debate was this chap. He was very outspoken and he rubbed a lot of architects and developers up the wrong way. He was very critical, for example, of the proposed extension to the National Gallery, called it a carbuncle. And indeed, such was the outrage that the architects were changed. He critical of the National Theatre. I think he likened it to a nuclear bunker. Wasn't his style. But within the city, one issue he particularly got involved with was the Mansion House scheme, or number 1 Poultry. Now, a lovely group of Victorian buildings, and what had been proposed in the late 1970s was this building. Peter Palumbo was the developer behind this, and he wanted to build a very dominant building here, and Prince Charles and others, of course, were highly critical of this, and successfully. In the end, that scheme was ditched in favour of James Stirling's design, which at least is low rise and doesn't dominate as much as the tower would have been. One building was finished in the 1980s that did raise everybody's eyebrows, which is Lloyd's, Richard Rogers's sort of first big scheme in this country, fresh from the Pompidou Centre in Paris, which was spectacular. And this was equally spectacular, and puzzled some of the people in the city. But one of the city councillors asked, when's the building going to be finished? What, these cranes? And obviously, those cranes are permanent. They are all to do with cleaning the windows. So they're part of the final design. And here it is, spectacular building. This was really I think the first example of high-tech modernism certainly in the city, in a commercial building. There was a big architectural debate in the 1980s, modernism versus postmodernism. And this was certainly modernism, as was this, a building known as the Green Giant, just off Chiswell Street. So that was modernism, and what was set against that was postmodernism, which was this extraordinary sort of confection of stick-on bits and fancy, lots of marble and granite. Architects had a whale of a time doing this stuff. This is Minster Court, Mincing Lane. Amazing building, really quite kitsch. These 3 horses, the 3 horsemen of lips. And then some of it was very dull. So this is almost Lego-like building on the Thames. So architects had fun. TVAM building at Camden Town with the egg cups. Sadly, that building's gone now. I don't know where the egg cups went, but somebody must have got some of them in their garden.
Sure, they're in
Newspapers have stuff, the architectural debate. Here's a redesign for the National Theatre. Very much tongue-in-cheek, because at this time the Globe project was underway at long last, to re-erect a facsimile, supposedly, of the old Globe. Other big buildings on the Thames, Terry Farrell. This is Charing Cross Station being rebuilt. Monster building. Although he was capable of more elegant things. This is another building in the city. Quite sort of Art Deco, really. A lot of postmodernism has that sort of Art Deco feel. And there are some good examples. It's very easy just to say that everything from the 1980s is rubbish. It's not. There's some good stuff. This is a building in Islington by John Melvin, actual social housing, very good quality. And here in Whitehall, a wonderful building, which again has been a battle to get that saved. The government wanting to pull it down and rebuild it, outrageous. But conservation of existing buildings was to some extent still in its infancy. The 1980s started off very, very badly because on August Bank Holiday Monday, 1980, this wonderful Firestone building, that happened on the bank holiday. It wasn't listed, there was no protection for it. So the developer just did it. Just down the road from here, Dock Street, look at this wonderful collection of buildings. One of the great sugar warehouses, the big building. There's a Georgian house on the right-hand side. Well, the Georgian house is gone. And there's the sugar warehouse going too. And what we ended up with was an empty site. Absolute tragedy. And there was just no control to stop this stuff at the time. There was graffiti, of course. People, there were people objecting to this stuff, but they really didn't have much clout. What we want is decent housing. And indeed, the government had cut the housing programme. And they'd introduced right to buy. So there was a withering of social housing, which we are still living with. The housing crisis we have today has its roots in the 1980s. We're still living with it. We still have that system today of expecting the private sector to provide social housing, and it simply doesn't work. One campaign I was involved with, the Union Chapel, which is an enormous congregational chapel built in the 1870s near Highbury Corner. Massive building. It could seat nearly 2,000 people. It had a congregation of 6. And they wanted to pull it down, which would have been a tragedy. And there was a successful campaign, actually largely because a new minister, wonderful lady, came along who had the idea of actually getting the church used for other activities, not just on a Sunday. And so it's proved it's a wonderful venue now for all sorts of things. There were campaigns in Covent Garden against developers who were wanting to be too greedy. Again, successful campaign to keep the Jubilee market. Money was raised and the building was saved from redevelopment. And south of the river, Coin Street, very close to the Hall, the South Bank, a successful campaign here, very much supported by Ken Livingstone and the GLC, which managed to fend off property developers and build social housing. Now, another big change in the 1980s, a different subject really, is shopping. These images from Upper Street, it could have been any high street really, but the shops were small, largely independent shops. So this could be anywhere. And there were fishmongers, pawnbrokers, some wonderful hardware shops that sold everything from paraffin to brooms and whatever. Little individual electrical shops, shoe repairers, all sorts of locksmiths, scrap metals. It was a different world because what was coming was this. The car. The car was now going to be the way that you would shop. It started to begin with these out of town stores, single story sheds with huge car parks. So the idea was that you'd, instead of sort of shopping every day for bits and bobs, you'd go in your car once a week, once a fortnight, fill everything up, fill your freezer, and that would be it. These shops then began to invade the inner city as well. This is quite a poignant. This is Wells Street in Hackney. Now, Wells Street had a fruit and veg market with stalls, And one of those stall holders a long time ago had been a guy called Jack Cohen. And Jack Cohen founded Tesco. And there we have Tesco opening a store in the street market where he had worked. And it killed off the street market. Very, very sad. Sainsbury's stores springing up on the high street. This is one in a striking architectural design in Camden Town. But what it meant was a lot of traditional shops were put out of business. Now, London had been full of individual dairy shops. There's Lloyd's in Amwell Street, wonderful shop front they had there, but they were all over the place. This is Evans in just off Fitzroy Square, French's Dairy just off Lamb's Conduit Street. These were all closed down. So people went to the supermarket to buy their milk, which is sort of what we still do. This sort of dairy shop has pretty much disappeared now. Also, what disappeared was the individual little local bakeries. This is the Holborn Bakery in Lamb's Conduit Street, put out of business by the supermarkets. And small chains of grocers like the International Stores, Victor Value, they couldn't compete with these new giants. Safeways, of course, was an American brand that sort of invaded. So essentially we were undergoing an Americanization of our shopping. Not just food, we started getting DIY stores. That was another big thing of the 1980s, is do it yourself. Huge boom in that of improving your home yourself, getting all the tools and kits to do it. And then the ultimate. The first IKEA store was actually in Warrington, which is an odd place, but the second one in this country was on the North Circular. And there it is, just opening. 1989 it opened. And a lot of people sort of worship the stuff that they sell. High street, familiar brands like Woolworths were now struggling. The huge range of stuff that Woolworths used to sell, all sorts of stuff, they were finding it very hard to compete with the B&Qs and IKEAs. And of course, they were to close. John Lewis, which had been a stalwart of town centres, they started to close some of their big stores, something that they are redoing again now. They're going through exactly the same issues as they did in the 1980s. This is the big John Lewis, or Jones Brothers as it was known, in Holloway. And there was an enormous sort of campaign to try and stop this, but John Lewis said, no, we're not going to do that. They were going to open a new store in Brent Cross where people could drive and park. So John Lewis closed 3 of their big sort of high street stores in London, John Barnes on Finchley Road, another one in Streatham. So it's really radical change.
Going to the Streatham.
Yeah. Pratt's, that's right. Yeah. A lot of the inner London shopping centres, this is the Brunswick Centre, we're going through a terrible time. It looked, the writing seemed to be on the wall on places like this. Another big change that was going on was the distribution of food and the wholesale markets. Radical change in the 1980s. This is Billingsgate, which had been in the city, Lower Thames Street, most extraordinary place. I was there on, these pictures were taken on its last night in February 1982. Just incredible scenes. People had worked there, man and boy, their traditional bobbin hats, the incredible frozen caves below, absolutely amazing. And they were moving to Canary Wharf, to West India Dock, where the big muddy site. They were one of the first things to go there before, this is long before the towers of Canary Wharf in 1982. And it was jolly muddy, right beside the water. Spitalfields Market, another fruit and veg market, they moved. Again, these scenes of what it used to be like, crowded with trolleys and vans, early morning market, and people coming to buy their stuff to go into the greengrocers shops, of which, of course, there were many in those days. And they moved out to Stratford, to a big site, Stratford. It has been old railway marshalling yards and whatever, and that's where it still is to this day. Borough Market, near Southwark Cathedral. This also started to shrink. The greengrocers shop was going out of business because everybody was buying their stuff from supermarkets, and supermarkets were not buying their produce from these wholesale markets. They had their own ways of getting produce directly from farmers. And so these extraordinary institutions started to wither or move completely. The one exception was Smithfield. Big battle to try and stop Smithfield being moved out, and that was successful in the 1980s. And I was quite heavily involved with that, partly because most of the people who worked in the market lived in Islington, and we were worried that they'd all lose their jobs if the market went. About 4,000 people. It was very old-fashioned place. Everything carried by hand, back-breaking work. But actually, as a result of the campaign to keep it, successful campaign, then modernization was eventually introduced in the 1990s. I wrote a book about Smithfield in 1980 and in 1990, so it's completely framed by the decade, it was a successful campaign. Of course, now decision has been taken to move all the markets much further out to Barking, and where the city's bought a large bit of land. So Billingsgate, the new Billingsgate, is going to move from their big site next to Canary Wharf, which must be worth billions of pounds, and also New Spitalfields is going to move. Again, they've got a 40-acre site here in Stratford, and Stratford is a hotbed of development now with all its railway, public transport infrastructure, Olympic Park, etc., etc. So they're going to go as well. There's the Spitalfields, the old Spitalfields, what it's become like now, very trendy. So the wholesale markets went through an enormous change in the 1980s, and we're going through that again now. So it's sort of a 40-year change. I became particularly interested in London street markets because they seem to be hugely under threat from the supermarket. And a lot of them seem to be in danger of closing down. So I did various books, or guidebooks really, but with a photographer who recorded, and these I think are really quite interesting images historically now. This is Berwick Street in Soho. Soho, of course, was still very, very scruffy. There's an underworld there of nightclubs and all sorts. It's cheap, dirty, and Berwick Street Market was the most incredibly wonderful place. You buy incredibly cheap fruit and vegetables. Portobello Road was a real second-hand market, incredibly cheap. It's not like this today. It's now very upmarket. Brick Lane. which was another extraordinary place on a Sunday, thronging with people, the most sort of abject poverty, people trying to sell odds and ends, all sorts of extraordinary characters there. There was an animal market, Club Row it was called, where people were still selling birds in cages, little puppies, whatever. RSPB managed to get it closed down eventually in 1986. Amazing people there, very photogenic if you were interested in that sort of thing. Again, Brick Lane is completely different now. It's sort of fast food, tourists, all this has gone. Funny little market is Cutler Street, just a stone's throw from here, where on Sundays there was a gold and silver market. Pretty dodgy stuff, but dodgy characters, but an amazing place. The Farringdon Road Book Market, where you could buy amazing things for almost nothing, just laid out on the pavement. Book dealers would go there and pick up incredible bargains. It was closed down it was an obstruction to the traffic. This is Whitechapel Market, again not far from here. Very ordinary market selling ordinary stuff, but there was a new Sainsbury's supermarket nearby, and the market seemed to be in danger of withering away. London was full of markets. Everywhere had these little markets. Is Westmoreland Road off the Old Kent Road. It's gone now. And this is Bell Street in Marylebone, and another place that has just disappeared. Huge amount of change going on. Broadway Market in Hackney, which had shrunk to virtually nothing. Some nice graffiti. Lambeth Walk, one of the great famous Victorian markets. Nothing left really there. A shadow of its former self. An Exmouth Market too, the last few stalls. We tried to do something about it in Exmouth Market by kicking the traffic out, but it didn't seem to have much immediate effect. Things, however, were going to turn round, and there were some pioneers. A few new markets were opening up. A few people really believed that the market had a future life. So this is Gabriel's Wharf beside Coin Street, and Greenwich Market, the wholesale market there, which had closed, was taken over and turned into a sort of bric-a-brac market. And those markets now have regenerated, and they've become a success story with careful management, getting the traffic out. This is Exmouth Market today. They're buzzing, but it's all food. People don't go and buy their fruit and veg there, so it's a different sort of thing. There were successful campaigns to reuse historic buildings. This is the Gaskin Street Congregational Chapel, which had been empty, a bit like the Union Chapel, but here not such a big building, but it needed a new use. It had ceased to be a church, and it became a recording studio, Angel Studios. So the reuse of historic buildings began to sort of take off. The agricultural hall near the Angel, enormous exhibition hall, which had been derelict since the war, and the whole thing was proposed for demolition. Massive site. Some of it did get demolished, but we managed to keep the great hall itself. A new frontage was put on in slightly some jazzy style, but then inside the Great Hall was refurbished and it became a new exhibition place for sort of specialist exhibitions. The old Booth's gin distillery in Clerkenwell been empty for about 20 years, and somebody took it over and converted it. Turnmills, it's called. It had a nightclub in the basement, which became rather notorious. But upstairs, it had affordable workspaces for craftsmen. There were people realizing that actually London still needed industry, and they should be nurtured. There were people starting to build new buildings. There's Janet Street Porter's house in Britain Street, very striking bit of architecture. There it is. And there were new sort of shops opening up, sort of wacky shops selling strange things, but a different sort of retail, I suppose, to replace the greengrocer and the hardware store. And then the other thing that was invading the high street were the estate agents. An enormous surge of estate agents in the 1980s. And this was all to do with a different form of housing market where you're encouraged to buy a house, buy a flat. That was get a mortgage. That was the whole mantra. And the estate agents fed off that. And then alongside these came the restaurants. Whole new form of eating out. Granita is sort of famously where Gordon Brown and Blair did their deal, who's going to be Prime Minister. But this was taken in the 1980s before they knew about it. And there was a big change in restaurants and cafes. So the traditional eel and pie place started to wither, I think. These traditional greasy spoons, I suppose you might call them. They do look very antiquated now, this sort of place. The days of the luncheon voucher. Yeah, we had luncheon vouchers in the 1980s. And Indian restaurants. But not the sort of sophisticated places that they are now. And certainly pubs. The idea of getting a meal in a pub was almost unheard of. You might get a pickled egg or a pickled onion, packet of crisps. But there were places to drink rather than the gastropub had not arrived in the 1980s. Sandwich shops. This was the old-fashioned sort of place. Friday night, Tubby Isaacs at the bottom of Petticoat Lane. There he is, very tubby. But there was something new to replace all this. And in 1987, in Kensington, two gentlemen opened this store. And yeah, there are many of them now. They dominate the way we buy our stuff. A lot of people rely on this sort of takeaway, completely different from the images before. Now, the other big change in London politically was the abolition of the Greater London Council, 1986. They knew it was coming, and they had a interesting little exhibition. This is a inflatable birthday cake. This is to celebrate the 95th birthday of the foundation of the London County Council. They knew they weren't going to get to 100. So they had this little exhibition to celebrate the amazing work that they had done in 95 years. It's easy, I think, we forget just how amazing the GLC and the LCC before them had been. They ran all the big parks, the Inner London Education Authority, so they were the education authority, the Transport Authority. There was the famous Fairs Fair, Livingstone wanted to reduce the cost of public transport to make more people use it. He was worried about everybody wanting to have cars. So the big campaign and a big political battle in the courts about all that. There was huge concern, I think, that public transport was not being properly funded. This is Dalston Junction Station running out Broad Street. Just real tragedy, really, that railways have been allowed to get into such a state. And there were some terrible accidents. This is Clapham, where about 35 people were killed. Just lack of maintenance. There was a huge concern. And of course, on the tube as well, the King's Cross fire, 1987, just lack of investment and terrible tragedy as a result, the wooden escalators. King's Cross itself was under the cosh. There were proposals to demolish most of it and to build a new tunnel and station for the line to the Channel Tunnel. The area in black was going to be demolished. Extraordinary. Fortunately, it came to nothing. But in the meantime, poor old King's Cross was just blighted. And dozens and dozens of buildings and sites just became abandoned, derelict. Again, extraordinary pictorially, photographers had the most wonderful time wandering around. The canal running through King's Cross and North London was a deserted place. Quite scary to walk along the canal because there was nobody about. I was attacked by some Alsatian dogs once when I was down. It was not pleasant, but very photogenic. St Pancras Station was rotting away. The idea of actually having the Eurostar station in St Pancras, nobody thought about that for some reason. They wanted to knock everything down and build a new station in the 1980s. Sheer madness, of course. And there was the interior of it. Very different now after all the work for Eurostar. London's public spaces were still dominated by traffic. This is Trafalgar Square, which was a roundabout. This is just outside the National Gallery. There's a racetrack. Extraordinary. Oxford Street, there's Selfridges, dominated by traffic. No idea really yet of trying to make it better for pedestrians. Not a fun place to be a cyclist. Hemmed in, gridlock, pollution. Camden High Street, again dominated, 4 lanes of traffic. There was one man who had a slightly different vision of the future, Clive Sinclair, with his C5, the first electric car. So 40 years ago, he was way ahead of his time, and of course slightly misguided because it seemed the most flimsy, dangerous thing to set out on the road in, very, very vulnerable. But he was, I think, a seer. He could see what was coming. He could see that climate change and whatever was going to become a future issue, and that we needed to get out of petrol cars. And there was a little bit of a scare in 1987, the Great Storm. Poor old Michael Fish got the forecast wrong, but the damage was spectacular. Trees coming down all over the place. This is Bloomsbury Square, Queen Square. Some amazing sights of the damage. It's interesting because there had been this is the Thames Barrier, which opened in 1982, I think it opened, and this was to try and prevent London flooding. There we have got the Queen and opening it with Ken Livingstone. I think the idea was that it would only need to be used 4 times in the next century. That was the prediction. Well, it's been used, I think in the last 5 years, it's been used about 20 times. So we need another one. Heathrow is still quite a primitive place. The package holiday, the cheap flights were not around yet in the 1980s. Flying was still quite expensive, quite elitist. And the facilities were actually surprisingly sort of porter cabins, in a way, completely different to what it is now with all the new terminals. London still occasionally had cold winters when ponds froze over. This is Wimbledon Common with people skating on it. Can't imagine when that's next going to happen. Another big issue, of course, of the 1980s was unrest amongst sectors of the community. A dreadful fire in New Cross triggered big reaction against the apathy of the police to investigate. We're still living with this 40 years on, this problem of the police and minority communities. But this was a big awakening of minority communities. And of course, it culminated 1982 in the Brixton riots. Huge, extraordinary amount of damage done by fires and looting and whatever, really out of control. But the Scarman report, which followed it, was an important bit of work, and it did expose huge shortcomings in the way communities were integrated and with the police. Because it wasn't just in Brixton, there were problems in East London, Tottenham, the Broadwater Farm, 1985, again, terrible rioting, death of PC Blakelock, of course. Some progress, but not enough. It's worth remembering that throughout the 1980s, there was a protest outside South Africa House. Throughout the 1980s, Nelson Mandela was in jail. So things were not changing particularly quickly. There was the whole Irish problem. Again, huge amount of violence, Hyde Park bomb, Regent's Park bombs, a lot of ghastly stuff going on, and seemed to be no solution in sight then. There was enormous worry at that time too about the whole nuclear problem with cruise missiles being Greenham Common, massive demonstrations in London, Hyde Park, against sort of nuclear. This was an extension, of course, of the CND that had been going on, but it seemed to come to a bit of a head in the 1980s. An enormous amount of public concern about it. When the Wind Blows and various quite extreme TV programs, which frightened people considerably, I think. But these rallies were spectacular. The other thing, a bit of echoes of COVID, was the AIDS scare. Again, I mean, as it turned out, the AIDS epidemic was nothing like as bad as COVID, but at the time there was a huge amount of hysteria in the press. Don't die of ignorance. The government sent around leaflets to everybody, and there was quite a lot of panic going on, particularly in the sort of gay community. And gay pride began to have a voice really in the 1980s, much more upfront. A lot of marches, demonstrations, and it became quite a political issue. Bermondsey by-election, and Simon Hughes, the winner, and Peter Tatchell in the background, who was absolutely given the most terrible time by the press and whatever. And of course, it was completely of Simon Hughes's nature. Anyway, it was a difficult time, I think, for a lot of these minority people. In Islington, the new MP, Chris Smith, he was the first MP to declare himself as gay. Very bold statement. He was heavily criticised in the press about it. Very extraordinary. And Islington had the first gay mayor, Bob Crossman. There is his partner. This was radical, very radical. Again, he was given a torrid time in the local and the national press, all tied up with the Socialist Republic. And then obviously the unions, constant marches and strife. It seemed to be everywhere. And of course, what was going to sort of bring the 1980s almost quite conveniently to a close was a very radical government idea, which was the poll tax. This actually, I think, sort of united the nation in a way that the other strikes and whatever hadn't. Of course, it turned out really to be the turning point for Mrs Thatcher. There is the spitting image of her. Well, just looking back at London, this is the view of London from Primrose Hill in the late 1980s. You can still see St Paul's there, and then that's looking further to the west with the Post Office Tower and the Euston Tower. But it's apart from those sort of 1960s buildings, it's a low-rise city. And again, alongside the river, this is from London Bridge, Bankside Power Station on the left there, Cannon Street. It's a very, very low-rise city and completely different today. So I think I've talked for long enough, too long probably, and I'm going to draw it to a close there. Very happy to take some questions if anybody's got any, and yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Alec. That was a marvellous
Need to click something.
revisiting of a decade that many of us knew personally. I think probably everyone here, actually. Look by the look at people. We all knew the 80s in one form or another. A very evocative and poignant recollection too. If there is anyone who would like to ask a question, we've probably got a little time now before we adjourn to the back and have a drink here. Yes?
Some of them are, yes. Yeah, and more stuff in the book. Yeah, I brought some copies along in case anybody wants one. Yes, I mean, some of them are by me, but most of them are by a photographer called Theo Bergstrom, who I did the Markets book with, and the Smithfield books. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was a very successful fashion photographer, fashion and food he did for magazines, and he did record covers for the Rolling Stones and stuff. But what he loved doing was tramping the streets of London and taking pictures. And yeah, they're very evocative, I think.
Do you have a book planned now, and have you another project on the go?
I do. I'm actually going to be doing a rewrite of Smithfield, because, as I said, that's going to be moving. The Museum of London is already moving into part of the market that was unused. So they're going to open, I think, in 2027. And then the rest of the meat market, the shrunken meat market that survives, is going to move to Barking in 2028. So a new book to tell that, another chapter on the end. So there's always something to write.
Keeping
about.
busy, really. Yes. Anyone else like to ask a question? Yes, please, Imka. Speak up.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned about the markets, I've struggled all done it quite well, and I used to work in one point. And my impression is that some of the so-called traditional markets, like Portobello, have turned into tourist attractions in their own rights. But the more standard markets where you buy your daily food and vegetables and other items seem to be more out of town where people actually live. In Romford, I bought a lot of my food and veg at the market and not in the big Sainsbury's because it was fresh and it was cheaper and good quality as well. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's good, and I agree that there's been a resurgence, I think, of the real market. I mean, I go to Ridley Road in Hackney at Dalston. It's a wonderful market, and it went through a bad patch in the 1980s and 90s, but I think people are rebelling against the supermarket now. There's also a feeling you're getting ripped off by the supermarkets, and you can buy cheaper and fresher in the street markets. Yes, long may that continue.
Primarily, that's put in the word water.
Yes, it's magnificent. Yes.
Partly because it needs to be defended against the impetus from the local council, because it's slightly messy in the arrangement. They've got the first part of it down, and it has this status of being very, very long market. Whether it's the longest one in Europe, I don't actually know, but it is said.
Yeah.
And it does provide a great service.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think they're terribly important markets, and they go back centuries. These things, don't
Yes.
they? And London is, I suppose, a collection of small towns and villages, and each small town and village needs its market.
Yeah.
And I think long may that continue.
Yes. Yes, please.
It's not really a question. Do you have any thoughts on whether continuity is possible with this sort of change? I'm thinking in particular the pictures you have of the Falklands. I remember it being pushed about in the late 70s. Since that time, not only have all the jobs in production, all of the thousands of workshops and factories around the edge have been replaced by flats. And the people are gone. The people who live there don't live there. It's the people who live in flats didn't have any connection. Is it possible to have any flat because there's not actually anything there?
Difficult where I think an area has been totally erased and rebuilt. I think that is quite difficult. But I do think there's a challenge at the moment for a lot of central London because of the changing way of working with offices. You see the city, there's nobody there on Monday and Friday. And I don't think you can easily sustain local shops and pubs or cafes or whatever on 3 days a week. So the answer, seems to me, is to convert some of these offices into residential. Let's get more people living in central town again, so that they will then support local facilities. Whether you could do that in Docklands, I don't know.
Building you showed near the beginning of the row of warehouses, that's about the only building that still exists.
Yeah, well, that was listed. It was very selective. A few buildings were listed, and then everything else was put down. Tragic, really. It could have been done so much better.
One more, yes.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's something I'm actually working with at the moment is the City of London Corporation, who are redoing their London plan, and previously the residential targets for more housing in the city has been tiny. But they need to change that. There's no reason why you couldn't have another 30,000 people living in the city, and that would change the place. And it needs some really radical thought. Otherwise, the centre of London's going to sort of wither away.
So, what about the ground floor areas which used to be shops? Can they also become at some point?
Well, I think ideally you'd have them as some sort of workplaces. So providing affordable workspaces for so that people can walk to work. I think it's a shame in a way if you've got an existing shopping street. If all the shops just become residential, it can become rather dead on the ground floor. So I think ideally you'd have residential above, with access to back garden, but then actually you keep a shop front with something going on in there, whatever that would be.
If you travel around on the upstairs of a bus, you can just see exactly how much empty space there is. And nobody rents out the spaces above shops anymore. It's too complicated.
No, I know. Well, we used to run one of the ways we eventually regenerated Exmouth Market was exactly that, getting the upper floors of the shops turned into flats. And we had a scheme called FOSS, flats over shops, and it was very, very successful actually, and got people living there, and there's, people want to buy stuff. So yeah, mixed communities is the answer.
Good. I think we should draw this now to a close, especially the formal part of the evening, and to people online as well. So thank you once again, Alec, very much for this most enlightening talk, very engaging, entertaining, and wonderful pictures that you brought with you. So thank you very much again. I suppose the pandemic has yet to play out its effect, and we wait to see what will become of London as a result, and perhaps people will move now back into the city centres, which have been vacated to a certain extent by the workforce, but we wait to see. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. Just to remind you that these talks take place every month, the third Tuesday each month. May brings us a talk on the tunnels that link north and south of the river, and we have Mohammed Arval from the Brunel Museum in South London who is coming to give us a talk on that. So please, if you are available in a month's time, do return. But now it just remains for me to thank Alec once again for you for coming. There we are. Thank you very much. Please do now join us at the back of the hall here for